Thank you, thank you. Thank you. You're too kind, you're too kind. Whoever's doing the audio, I'm losing my voice, so can you you turned it up. Very nice, very nice. Thank you very much, Brad. You were very funny. That's a great story. Round of applause for Brad, who's doing a great job as our MC. Also, round of applause for Josh. This is a pretty successful night, Josh. You did well. Packed the room up, lots of people here. Round of applause, our good friend. So there's no surprise who the keynote speaker is going to be, but I have the opportunity to do something I think is really special. I want to say the things that maybe Premier Horgan wanted to say about himself, but never could or would, because he's not about talking about himself. So allow me, please indulge me in saying some of the incredible things about this great leader. First of all, I'll tell you a story that I think encapsulates a lot about John and his infectious spirit and passion. We were in a rally in 2019 in Victoria. We were creating lots of buzz in our federal election, and there was word on the street that there would be a jump, often known as the Jagmeet jump, that would happen as a part of the rally. And John came to me and said, "Jagmeet, I'm not doing the jump." And I said, "That is completely understandable, sir. You don't have to do the jump." He's like, I've injured myself, otherwise I would. My team has advised me not to do it. I said, "No problem, sir. No jump is required. Your presence is more than enough." The music gets on, the energy is there, and jumping higher and far more than me is the Premier of BC, and I was very honored. Afterwards, he blamed me for not being able to walk for about a week. And I reiterated that I had said very clearly that you did not need to jump, but that's his infectious spirit and energy. Folks know that he is an avid Star Trek fan, but I want to share with you, shout outs to Star Trek, yes. 4 people over there like Star Trek, thank you. I also love Star Trek. I want to talk about a couple of things that people should know about Premier Horgan. He is someone that has always been rooted in his community. He is very proud that he serves the riding of Langford-Juan de Fuca, known as the John de Fucans. There's a couple of John de Fucans over there, I think. He is very proud of hailing from the high school, Reynolds High School, and doesn't hesitate to mention that. And if any Reynolds High School students ever make their way to the legislature, he drops everything to give them a personal tour. But when I asked him about what he's most proud of, I thought this was very beautiful. Before we got into that, he mentioned that he is a man right now in his early 60s, and he will be in his early 60s until he turns 70. I didn't quite understand the math on that one, but I thought it was really beautiful when I asked him what he's most proud of, that he mentioned right away that he was most proud that the province of BC, under his leadership, brought in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People Act, which is something very transformative, very special. But he said one more thing that I thought was quite powerful, that for a long time in BC, the BC Liberals had a stranglehold on the province. And they had created this notion that you couldn't vote for New Democrats, that it would be dangerous, things would go, and he said some expletives to describe what people would say, where things would go, if you voted for New Democrats. And he's really proud that under his leadership, and I think it's something that he should deserve a lot of accolade for, that he changed the face of the New Democratic Party. He showed really clearly that you could vote for New Democrats and they would be a competent, compassionate government that cared for people and put people first. And I think that's what his leadership has done. That's what he's shown people and really transformed the view of New Democrats. He didn't want me to do this. He didn't want me to do the second part, but I'm going to do it anyways. He was like, "Nah, don't talk about the achievements." I'm like, "I'm going to talk about them." He's like, "Don't talk about them. I'm going to do it." And then he said, "If you do talk about it, mention a couple of these things." I said, "Sure." He didn't actually say that last part, but I thought it sounded funny. I was on the auto insurance beat when I was in provincial politics, and I would always point to auto insurance in public provinces or public jurisdictions and say, it's amazing that auto insurance can be so affordable and take care of people. This may sound a bit nerdy, but the BC model was incredible, was brought in by New Democrats, but the BC Liberals, like many other things, ruined it and were raiding it, stealing money from it. But under Premier Horgan and the BC NDP turned this around. It is incredible. It provides great service for the people of BC, and now people are getting rebates and getting money back in their pockets at a time when people are feeling the squeeze. So turned around a public institution and made it work for people, something I think is incredible. Please just clap to make me feel less nerdy. Got rid of the MSP, which was a health premium to make sure public healthcare is truly public. It shouldn't have to cost anything out of pocket. Got rid of the MSP, which is a big deal. Loan for students, interest-free for students in the BC province. Childcare, a leader on bringing in childcare that's affordable. Student housing. Built hospitals, put in place a primary care network system. Card check certification under the BC NDP, yes. And not surprisingly, soon after CardCheck was brought in, I met with these incredible young workers at a Starbucks that were able to organize and join a union because of that change, immediately making it easier for workers to be able to have that power to join a union. So we saw that work right away. Many, many other achievements, but I just want to say one last one. There were healthcare workers, mostly women, many racialized in the HEU, that were fired and they were contracted out by the BC Liberals. That has been repatriated. Those workers are coming back to the public fold, and legislation was recently passed around this, so that's a huge win for workers, for women, for racialized workers. So, I'm just really honored to say that John has been a friend to me. We've had a great relationship. I've leaned on him for some good counsel. He's been very straight up with me, true to character, and been very supportive as well. And I am really honored to be able to say some great words about this great man, and to ask you all to stand up and give a round of applause for the MLA for Langford, Wandafuka, and the 36th Premier of British Columbia, Premier John Horgan.
Oh, thank you, Jagmeet. Thank you, friends. It is great to be back in Ottawa on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. It is really something. I've seen some people I haven't seen in a long time. I started working here in 1986. I'm glad that Carl was able to remind me of my successes in the hockey pool at the local bar. Thank you for that. That was a distraction, Ed. We were working all the time, I assure you. The libations were light beer, and there was no hard liquor, if I recall. But it was nice to relive some of that. Some of the poolies are here tonight. I saw Rob Sutherland. I didn't recognize him. He's living in the woods now, out in Arnprior, or out to, what's the name of the lake? It's the Sutherland Lake, out to the west here. But when I first arrived on the Hill, the person that greeted me was Ian Waddell, the great member of Parliament. And yeah, let's give it up for Ian, who's sadly no longer with us. I didn't think that the world could do without Ian, and Ian always told us that as well, so it was quite a surprise that he passed on. But he, not only was he a great member of Parliament for Vancouver Kingsway, Don Davies can attest to that, Don's here tonight, but he also became a suburban MP when there was a redistribution and Kingsway disappeared into the ether. And Ian took to the suburbs really well. He wore long pants and button-down shirts and everything. He did very well despite that. And he was a mentor not just to me, but to my friend and colleague Adrian Dix and to Mike Farnworth. All three of us were in what was called the 213 Club. Any other 213 Club members here? There's one. Thanks, Tim. We were people who voted for Ian Waddell to be leader of the NDP to replace the venerable Ed Broadbent. I don't know what we were thinking. Dave Barrett was on the ballot, But I had, true to form, I had made a commitment to Ian. He was the only BC member at that time on the ballot. And Dave came in late, and I had made a commitment to Ian, and as my mom told me, if you make a commitment, you need to stick with it, and I've been doing that ever since, not just to support Ian, but to support this great movement that I am so proud to be part of. I came to my social democracy not through family lineage, but through happenstance and accident, which I think is the best way, quite frankly, to become a social democrat. I was going to university just down the street in Peterborough at Trent University, which is also the alma mater for Nathan Cullen and Sheila Malcolmson. So we have a Trent caucus now in the BC government. And that government, of course, and as Jagmeet said, is the first government in Canadian history to have more women than men in the caucus, not just the cabinet, but in the caucus. More racialized members than ever before, LGBTQ members, and unapologetically the first South Asian Speaker of the legislature. The firsts keep piling up in British Columbia, as they have done since the days of Dave Barrett. But my coming to social democracy was circuitous in that I was going to Trent University and I was studying, I got double waters? I had the cancer, you might have heard about that, and I don't have any saliva, so I pound a lot of water, so apologies. That's a good clap time. Let's clap for the cancer. There you go. So I'm at Trent University and I was studying social work. I wanted to help people. That was my motivation, my passion. And I was studying psychology and other types of undergraduate courses that you would take to go into a career in social work. And one of my roommates said, let's go up to the campus and hear Tommy Douglas. And I said, who's Tommy Douglas? He said, oh, he's the great leader of the Saskatchewan CCF NDP. He brought us public health care. And I said, oh, that's great, but I got a paper due. I can't go. And so he said, well, I'll buy you a beer. And sadly, there was a price to my social democracy, and it was a little tiny Ontario midi, I think they call them, little tiny glass of beer. We have bigger beers than the rest of Canada, but they have these little tiny beers here in Ontario. So I went out to the campus, and there were maybe 40 people there. 1981 was a pivotal point for social democracy. It was a pivotal point for Canada, quite frankly. I was oblivious to all of that. I was just a guy from British Columbia, knew nothing about anything. I was a kid. And this little man came onto the stage. He was wizened, he was small, and then he started to speak. And the power of his voice was enough. But when you added the power of that voice to the message he was delivering, I was smitten. It was love at first sight for me, and I immediately, in the next semester, changed into history and political science, and I looked into the League for Social Reconstruction and the genesis of the CCF and the NDP, out of dissent, people from different perspectives coming together with common purpose. Not one better than the other, not labor over academic, not social gospel over community activity, but everyone working together. At least that's how it's written up in the history books. I don't know if it was like that at all. Ed, you were there. Maybe you can tell us about it. But that's not fair. I'm sorry for that, Ed. But the story of the genesis of the CCF was very powerful for me, and I was smitten at that point, and I carried on. I got an undergraduate degree in political science and Canadian studies, and I was accepted into an Australian university to do my master's in comparative federalism, an odd thing to study in Australia, but really not if you think about it. I don't think people are Googling now the makeup of the federation in Australia. Ed knows all about it. You're going to be up next, Ed, so take notes. And so I was waiting on tables, as one does with an undergraduate degree at the time, and I had the tips from the night before, and I've already commented on the table maintenance of the catering company here, top notch. I've given my props. I can't give a gratuity, but thank you to the servers and everyone. And I went to the legislature on a particular day when about 25,000 other people showed up in a thing called Operation Solidarity. It was a movement, again, not unlike the creation of the League for Social Reconstruction and the CCF. It was a group of working people, labor activists, community workers, those who would speak for those who had no voice, standing in unison against a government that was introducing cruel and draconian policies at a time when interest rates were in the 20% range, inflation was running rampant, and they were trying to quell and suppress the rights of workers and the rights of communities. So I was moved by that, and I went to the legislature, and there was a massive crowd. I mean, when people say, oh, there's a big protest out front, and I look out the window and I laugh, and I shouldn't do that, because every time someone comes from dissent, I've been to more protests than I can remember, quite frankly, but that solidarity movement was a seminal moment for the labor movement in British Columbia, not unlike what's happening right here in Ontario right now. And so when I see working people, labor leaders coming together, standing shoulder to shoulder, putting aside their differences with a common focus, I'm inspired by that. So I lift my hands to the labor movement in Ontario. So there started to be a buzz in the crowd that something was going to happen, something important was going to happen. And keep in mind, I'd just become acquainted with Tommy Douglas just a year or two earlier, and I'd been living in Ontario. I didn't know who Dave Barrett was. I had no idea. He was in government when I was a teenager. He did away with corporal punishment. That was good for me. I was happy about that. But he did a whole range of other things, and I'll get to that later on. But I really didn't know anything about Dave Barrett. And out onto the stairs of the legislature he came, a little bit roly, a little bit poly, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, and he started to shake, as Dave would do. And he had 25,000 people roaring to do whatever he asked them to do. And it was so powerful. I was just going, I can't believe that all of this has been going on in my lifetime, and I didn't know anything about it. That speaks to our K-12 system in British Columbia, which we're improving, and we're making sure that these stories are being told. And of course, this foundation is all about telling those stories as well. But for me, Dave could have said, pick up this building and throw it into the inner harbor, and I'm confident people would have done that. But he didn't say that. He said, and I've written it down, and you notice that I brought paper up here, and I'll refer to it periodically, and this is one of those moments. So it'll take me a minute because I'm supposed to turn the pages as I go, and I never do that. But what Dave said at that time is no struggle for human or economic justice is won in one day. Let's make this the positive beginning for change. Now, as someone who wanted to pick up a building and throw it in the water, that was a bit disappointing. But when I look back on it today, it was pitch perfect, because it's absolutely correct. You cannot change the world overnight. It takes work, it takes collaboration, it takes cooperation, it takes putting your interests to one side to support the collective interest of everyone. And that's what this foundation represents. That's what the NDP has represented my entire lifetime, which for me began in 1981 when I met Tommy Douglas. So I left the legislature and I walked down Blanchard Street. Those who know Victoria will be aware of that. And there was the NDP office was on Blanchard, and I walked in and I said, I'd like to help. And the woman, it was Pat McGuire, bless her, she was behind the counter, and she said, well, you could join the NDP. And I reached into my pocket and I pulled out and I said, I've only got 10, and before I could say bucks, it was out of my hand and into a drawer, and I had become a member of the BC NDP. Now, how many people have experienced that? I've only got 10, and then it's gone. Powerful moment for me, and I've never looked back. I came to work here after I returned from Australia on the Hill, opening the mail for a guy named Jim Manley. Comes from the social gospel stream of the NDP at that time. I think, Ed, how many pastors did you have? You had Blakey, you had Heaps. 12 pastors. 112. Not in that caucus, we only had 40 members. I think that's why you thought we were so popular, Ed. There weren't that many. It seemed like 112. There could have been over time, but at that moment when I was there was Dan Heap, there was an Anglican, a gaggle of United Church members, Jim Manley, Bill Blakey. Father Bob was not there during my time. There was a couple of others, and I apologize to those who follow the social gospel for not being able to recite them all, and I didn't know there was 112, but I'll look that up. But working on the Hill was my introduction to retail politics. And I remember working on an election campaign in Oshawa for Mike Bria, who was running to be an MPP. Good man. And Ed was at the zenith of his popularity, I think. You were in the 40s in public opinion polls, was going to be the next Prime Minister of Canada, and this was a kind of a warm-up act to go to Oshawa to win the seat back for Mike Bria. And I was driving a 1967 Buick that had been made in Oshawa by Ed's brother. There was a little sticker on the back. It didn't say made by Ed's brother, but it was made by the United Auto Workers at that time. And they thought that was the coolest thing in the world. This kid from BC is driving a 20-year-old car, and there's no rust on it, because that's life in British Columbia, my friends. The snow falls tomorrow, and that Prius you have is going to be dust in a year or so. But that's just life. But anyway, I had this 67 Buick, and the results were coming in, and Mike was returned overwhelmingly. But Ed and his press secretary at the time, Tim Woods, needed a lift to the party. And Ed, of course, was the show. He had to get there early so that they could do the media, and then Mike could come in triumphantly. And so Ed said, well, I'll use your car. And I went, yeah, but you got to kind of jiggle the key, and you got to hit the radio a little bit. And he just he had a cigar in his mouth at the time, and he grabbed the keys with a big smile on his face, hopped in my 67 Buick Stampede, we called it, because it was big enough to be at the Calgary Stampede. And I get to the hall after the event, and we counted the votes. And of course, I can freely disclose this because it's only CPAC. No one will watch this. It was my job as the outsider to make sure that all of the data from the campaign got back to federal office. I can admit that now, can't I? Okay, good. There's no statute of limitations on taking, there was no Freedom of Information and Privacy Act at the time, so I don't think I violated. I've got counsel here, I'm good? Thank you. So I get there, and Ed's got the keys, and he's still got that big smile on his face. He said, I parked it around front, and it was a big car. It was a big car. And so I went outside where Ed had left it, but he hadn't parked it in a stall. He hadn't parallel parked it. He kind of nosed it in, and there was about 15 feet from the back of the vehicle to the sidewalk. The windows were down, and I got in, and I juggled the key, and I turned it up, and Bob Marley was just raging on the ghetto blaster in the car, and I thought, well, at least Ed's having a good time. And that's my last story about Ed, I promise. I'm not going to do any more, Ed. But it was for me such an honor to work, and I said this to some of the younger people in the room tonight, that for me to be able to meet and work with Ed Broadbent, I went into Stanley Knowles was still alive when I was working on the Hill, and all of us youngsters were obliged to go and see Stanley on a Friday afternoon and eat one of the biscuits that he had brought over on the train in the 40s, and they were terrible biscuits. But Stanley would apportion one to each staffer, and we would drink our tea, and we would tentatively eat. Guy Friedman, you remember that? Guy's here? Where are you? Do you remember eating the biscuits? Yeah, oh man. I love Manitoba. But that was my introduction to not just, as I said, I had an academic interest in the movement. I had a $10 investment in the movement, and then I had the opportunity to work with Ed Broadbent. And at the point when the federal NDP was at its strongest, we were going to win Quebec. We had won a couple of by-elections at that point. Carl, you had nothing to do with that. Yeah, but it was a very positive time for me. And then something extraordinary happened. Bob Rae became the Premier of Ontario. Yeah, well, no, I don't think so. I think Bob Rae became the Premier of Ontario. That's a big deal. Have we had any since then? I don't recall. Anybody? Anybody at all? So what Bob did with the rest of his life is inconsequential. In 1990, it is. In 1990, he changed the electoral map in Canada. Mike Harcourt was supposed to win. Roy Romano was supposed to win. Gary Dewar finally won. And those things were supposed to happen. But we were never going to win in the heartland. We were never going to win in Ontario. And Bob Rae and the Ontario NDP did that. And here's my challenge. Here's my challenge to all of you. Say what you will, feel what you want about Bob Rae, but if we can do it once, by God, we must be able to do it again. We must be able to do it again. Because it is only through winning an election that we actually get to mess with the levers of power. Jagmeet talked about a couple of the things we've been able to accomplish in British Columbia. You saw Rachel earlier on, and the extraordinary things that happened in Alberta. Another, holy cow, did that really happen moments. And it's going to happen again. It's going to happen again. So, in order to affect the change that we all want to see for ourselves and our families and our communities, we need to win elections. And how do we do that? We don't have existential debates with buildings. We don't yell at people who are not there. We reach out to people who we've never talked to before, and we convince them that we are on the right path and they should join us, because we're talking about the things that matter to them. Not the list of grievances that we've assembled over decades, but what are we going to do right now, today, for you? That's what voters need to hear, and that's what we need to deliver. We've done that in British Columbia for 2 successive elections, and we're going to do it for 1 more after that. I want to, before I get into the inventory, the shopping list of successes, which are significant, and Jagmeet's quite right. I've tried not to in this farewell tour, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this, and to relive my very fond memories of being here in Ottawa. Both of my children were born here, and I was in an ice storm for the second one. I've never experienced that ever again, I hope. There was an inch of ice on our car when we came out of the hospital. They've just given us this baby we know nothing about, and we got to pick the ice off the car before we go anywhere. Who does that? How civilized is that? Surely there's got to be somewhere in public health care that we can find a way to get the ice off the cars in the parking lot, at least for the maternity ward, at least for that. Sadly, we weren't able to do that. But it is great to be here, and I wanted to make an announcement tonight because I'm very excited about this. We just recently, not only is it 50 years for Douglas Coldwell Layton, but it was also 50 years ago that Dave Barrett was elected Premier of British Columbia. So we've been kind of partying it up pretty big on the West Coast as a result of that, remembering all of the extraordinary things that Dave Barrett did in 3 years without access to Twitter or Instagram. He was able to do extraordinary things. And they were writing legislation literally on their desks in the legislature. We have to go through Leg Council, we have to have the lawyers get involved, and it's all to the good, that's as it should be. But back in Cowboyville, when Dave Barrett and his crew rolled into town, that's not how they rolled. They just got shit done, as they say in the business. And so I'm pleased tonight to announce that effective next year, there will be an annual Dave Barrett lecture at the University of Victoria, and it's going to be supported by many of the people in this room, particularly the creation of a Douglas Coldwell Layton Foundation scholarship and bursary for the political science department at UVic. And I think that is an absolutely ideal testament to the work that Dave did to make sure that we can continue to tell the stories about the importance of social democracy. The lecture series will be all about that. It's not going to be about organizing E-Day. It's not going to be about what's the communication strategy for the last 5 days of the campaign. It's going to be about the importance of the issues that you are all here in your heart to hear about. The value of collective action, the importance of hanging firm in solidarity when bad governments do bad things. But it's not, friends, just good enough to complain about the badness of the people in power. You need to throw them out. And you need to form a government to form a better community and a better parliament. So what did Dave Barrett do in 3 short years? He created the Agricultural Land Reserve. How prescient do you have to be in a time of scarcity and a time of disruptions of supply chains when our food basket, at least on the West Coast, is now a desert, where drought has made our access to food so dire? We have in British Columbia assembled lands that is restricted to one thing and one thing only: feeding people. That is forward-looking. That was Dave Barrett, and it is still there despite 50 years of right-wing governments trying to do away with it. Because you know what developers really like? Flat land. You know what carrots really like? Flat land. So I'm going to take the carrots, put the condos somewhere else, and Dave Barrett's allowed us to do that in British Columbia. We talk about pharmacare, started in British Columbia. Guaranteed annual income for seniors, started in British Columbia. I mentioned the end of corporal punishment, really important to me. Apparently you had to pay to use a toilet in British Columbia. I don't remember that. Ed, do you remember that? Okay, so apparently it happened, and Dave Barrett did away with it. So toilets are now free in British Columbia. Good thing, good thing. Hansard, recording the debates in our legislature. The right of center parties didn't believe that was necessary because they didn't want anyone to know what they were doing. But now, because of Dave Barrett, there is Hansard in British Columbia. There is a daily question period, which I used to relish, and now not so much. But the notion of transparency, the notion that we do our business, the people's business, in a way where everyone can see it, and if they're not available in the galleries to hear it, they can find it somewhere else. Of course, now with technology that's odd, we can, Jagmeet's voting right now on his phone, I understand, which is the coolest thing ever, I think. But so change is part and parcel of who we are as Social Democrats. And affecting that change only happens meaningfully, and I don't want to diminish the work of the federal caucus and the supply agreement, and Jagmeet and I talked about that before it arrived, and how we can work together as a premier in BC with the federal caucus to advance these issues. I know I've got brothers and sisters from British Columbia, large numbers, always, hey Ed, the BC caucus, always the biggest and the best, and the most focused on getting home every day. Jim Fulton, and again I can say this on CPAC, Jim Fulton, one of the greatest guys you'd ever meet, pulled a salmon out of his pants and dropped it on a desk and during debates. Anyone remember that? Not enough. Ed remembers it very well because he had to discipline him. Ed spent a lot of time disciplining Waddell and Fulton because they just were not on the same page as the rest of the caucus. But Fulton had a deep, rich suntan, and he lived on Haida Gwaii. He lived on Haida Gwaii, which can have a bit of rain on occasion. Sometimes 14 feet in a year, but Jim had a great rich tan, and he would always go at Christmas, at the Christmas break, he would leave, and most MPs go back to their home. And so when Jim said he was on the island, everyone assumed he was talking about Haida Gwaii. But this rich, deep tan belied that, but he had a strategy, and I don't believe it was his idea. This was implemented by staff, so all of the staff in the room, this is something to keep in your back pocket. Every Friday, staff would phone the Crest Hotel and page Jim Fulton. And so the bartender would take the call. This was pre-cell phones, so we used to have little boxes. We'd go in and we'd put coins in to talk to somebody. And so they would phone the Crest in and they'd page Jim Fulton. So the bartender would say, "Is Jim here? Jim Fulton, phone for you." And everyone in the bar, which is where Jim's base was, would say, "Oh, Jim's in town." And they'd all look around. And of course, he was on the island. Jamaica, not Haida Gwaii. But that was what, again, I didn't want to bring you back into this, Ed, but those are my formative years. These are my formative years. Way more fun than legislation and creating childcare spaces and giving opportunity to people, doing away with tuition fees for former kids in care. When your children grow up, when they turn 19, you don't say, "Well, we're done now, off you go." Some people do that, but we don't do that. No one in this room does that. And the government shouldn't do that either. If you're a child that's been bounced around from foster home to foster home, in care, out of care, the last thing you need is to be told when you're 19, "Our relationship is over, best of luck." So one of the first things we did as a government was waive tuition fees for former kids in care and ensured that they had a place to live until they were 26 years old. Little tiny investment, transformative for people's lives. And every time someone is given opportunity, as I was, to pick up my car in front of the UAW hall in Oshawa, whenever someone's given opportunity, good things will happen. When opportunity is suppressed, that's when unrest begins. That's when social dislocation happens. One thing that Social Democrats have always talked about since the 1930s and even before then was how do we lift everyone up? How do we leave no one behind? How many times is that? Anne McGrath, you've done 600 campaigns. How many times have we said we're leaving no one behind? 590 at least. And it's true. Because when we get an opportunity to form government, the first order of business is to make sure that the vulnerable and those without voice are empowered and given voice, so that their issues are not just something that other people talk about, but legislators talk about. How do we fix these things? How do we make life better for people? By providing opportunity. We've been investing in STEM seats in our post-secondary institutions like never before. The largest investments in housing in our history, and it's still not enough. But I can't imagine what the past 5 years would have been like if David Eby hadn't turned over the rocks when it came to money laundering and the illicit money that was driving up prices for housing in the Lower Mainland. If David hadn't been given that job by a far-sighted leader, I don't know where we would have been. I don't know where we would have been. Jagmeet talked about the HEU, and actually he used most of the good stuff, Jagmeet, so I'm just going to embellish a bit and polish up the rough bits. We talked about the Hospital Employees Union. When I first ran for office, and I have to say at the outset, as much as I came to my passion for people and social democracy from a good place, I never saw myself as someone in the front. I always was supporting good people. That was what I thought was my purpose. I didn't really like people not liking me. It was son of a widowed mom and a sister and two brothers that were out of the house before I can remember. I was always trying to make my mom happy. And so I've kind of lived my life. How long did I get? Okay, let's pause for some water. Maybe a clap would be good, though I catch myself. Because I have a sleeve with a heart on it, I thought that I wouldn't be very good at the front of room activity. But Adrian convinced me that if I really wanted to work with smart people again within government, I'd worked in the Harcourt government, I worked in the Clark government, I worked in the Dan Miller government. I often say there were 4 premiers, BC NDP premiers in the 90s, and I worked for 3 of them. If you want to be unhappy about Bob Rae, say Ujjal Dosanjh in British Columbia and see what you get. Knock, knock. Who? Ujjal Dosanjh. Who? Knock, knock. Anyway, never mind. So these things happen along the road. And for me, I had the opportunity to work with these great premiers and to work with the public service, the professional public service. And it was there that I really found the power of government to affect positive change. It was not just theoretical anymore. It wasn't academic anymore. It was real. And people's lives were in the balance. And we did extraordinary things during the 1990s. We're remembered for building some boats out of aluminum. But we did other things as well. But that was the issue that our opponents grabbed onto, as I said to Jagmeet, and they branded the NDP as incompetent, incapable of effective leadership in government. And that wasn't the truth, but that was how we were branded. That's the power of a good message, and they had a good one, and we didn't have a counterpoint to that. Jenny was there. She remembers it, I'm sure, as much as she'd like to close her eyes and forget about it. And it was a very difficult time. We were annihilated. We had 2 members of the legislature, Jenny and Joy McPhail, and they lived 6 blocks away from each other. And to make it worse, we had gone in British Columbia from having 19 members of parliament in 1991, in the Ed Broadbent wave of 1988, to 2, Sven's and Libby Davies. So Sven was in Burnaby, which might as well be Vancouver. Libby was in Vancouver. Jenny was in Vancouver. Joy was in Vancouver. There were 4. We had 70 members of parliament and members of the legislature a decade earlier, and then we had 4. That's a dark period in our history, I'd have to say. But we turned that around. It took 3 elections to do it, or was it 4? I think it was 4. Anyway, it took a long time. But we focused, in the end, on talking to people and discounting the mythology of this terrible time during the 1990s. And we've been able to turn things around to the point where, while I was campaigning, because Adrian convinced me that I should get a nomination, while I was campaigning, I met health employees, usually couples, quite often, a man and a woman, or 2 women, 2 men were working in healthcare. And they were sharing accommodation, because even though they had the power of a collective agreement, they weren't breaking the bank. The BC Liberals oversaw the largest firing of women in North American history. Not because it was good for patients, not because it was good for healthcare, because they wanted to give a tax break to the wealthiest people in British Columbia. It was absolutely grotesque. It wasn't good policy, it was cruel and inhuman treatment of people who we asked to care for the most vulnerable, people who are in hospitals, people who are in long-term care facilities. And the Liberals said, you don't have a collective agreement anymore. Those rights that you bargained for are now taken away. Your wages are being cut, and oh, by the way, we're firing half of you. That was the BC Liberal record, and it took us 3 or 4 elections, was it 4? Thanks, Jenny, to turn that around. But here's the good news, brothers and sisters. We made commitments as candidates in 2005, the first opportunity we had to overturn those draconian policies. And we made those commitments again in 2009, and again in 2013, and again, finally in 2017, we were rewarded with a minority government. And so we started to work to build on the hard work of the Hospital Employees Union, who went all the way to the Supreme Court to get a positive ruling on how hideous the abuse of democratic rights was by the former government of British Columbia. But it took us another election before we could repatriate those workers. And to be at the Hospital Employees Union convention this year, where hundreds and hundreds of racialized women and men were now brought back into the public health care system, their rights to free collective bargaining restored, and a pretty generous collective agreement that they ratified just a few weeks ago. So it took us 4 elections to undo an injustice, but that's what New Democrats do when they're given the opportunity. The biggest impact in my mind on all of our labor legislation was that. Card check, critically important. Making sure that asbestos is now handled in a way that's addressing the hazardous nature of it. Making the list of presumptive cancers for firefighters longer and shorter makes a huge difference in people's lives. We asked the federal government during COVID, and I heard earlier in the presentations talk about the sick days for federally regulated workers. I asked the Prime Minister, as did other premiers, but I was the most vociferous, that there should be a national sick day program. If you can't come to terms with that during a global pandemic, when we're saying to people, do not put yourself and your colleagues at risk by going to work, don't we have an obligation to have sick days for these people so they don't have that choice to make? They don't have to choose between feeding their families or putting themselves and their workers at risk, their co-workers at risk. Well, it didn't come to pass. So the power of being in government allowed us to put in place 5, not 10, but 5 permanent paid sick days for every worker in British Columbia. Not because it was our responsibility to do it, but because it was the right thing to do. It wasn't there before, it is there now because British Columbians elected a social democratic government. That's the power of forming government. Okay, I got lots of pages here. Okay, we talked about going from the worst to the best and the best to the worst. We had the lowest minimum wage in 2017. Now we have the highest minimum wage, and it's indexed to inflation. So not only are the lowest paid workers going to get another raise this year, it will be indexed to the cost of living. That's as it should be. And that, friends, in the labor movement, as you know, is the floor, not the ceiling, for how we protect workers' rights. It is a workers' market out there. There is so much need in every sector of the economy. I have young children, they're men. I have kids who are in the workforce, and they can call their shots. And that's fantastic. That's as it should be. But all of us old-timies in here have to recognize and acknowledge that it's going to cost a little bit more for the services that we've been taking for granted. And if we're not prepared to pay the least among us a living wage, then why should we anticipate the best services possible? We shouldn't, and we can't, but we can if we turn it upside down and say, workers are driving the boat now. We need investment, we need private sector growth, but we need workers more than we need that money, because we've got a lot of stuff to do in the public sector, and the private sector can't find people. That's the challenge we have ahead of us, whether it be on housing, whether it be on building schools, hospitals, and other infrastructure. We need more people. So what did we do in British Columbia? We created a community benefit agreement so that every time we're spending public money on public infrastructure, we don't just get the building, we don't just get the bridge, we don't just get the road, we get apprenticeship training for women, apprenticeship training for marginalized populations, and apprenticeship training for Indigenous people. That's an investment in our future as well as in our infrastructure. How are we doing, Brad? Carry on? Okay. I promised I wouldn't tell the water story, but I might do that. Depends on how much time we've got left. So I talked about opportunity. I've had no shortage of it. I've been a lucky Irishman most of my life. I've had cancer twice, and I'm still standing here, still happy, cancer-free. I want to be sure of that. A lot of people think that I'm leaving because I'm expiring. I'm leaving because I want to relish and enjoy the days I have ahead, and I know that not a single person begrudges me that, but it is bittersweet. I have loved doing this work. It has been the honor of my life. Pause. and to have the opportunity, Brad, thank you for the invitation, to have the opportunity to come here to Ottawa, to the nation's capital, to the place where it kind of all started for me, working on the Hill, just an impressionable staffer. I said to Jenny, I said, sometimes I think I'm going to pinch myself and I'm going to wake up in the Confederation cafeteria and I'm 30 years old again and none of this happened. It's just been a really cool dream. But it hasn't been a dream. It's been a life lived on the principles and values of every single person in this room. Issues will divide us along the road. We will disagree. There are some of the debates we have in caucus meetings, holy cow. But once that's over, the values that brought us all here unite us. So we can agree to disagree on the nuances of the things that are passing in the night, but the things that brought us to this room tonight, the things that brought us to this movement are burned into our souls. And if we continue to focus on lifting people up, leaving no one behind, winning elections so that we can affect real change, this movement will not just thrive and prosper. It will be the dominant political force in Canada. I say all the time that British Columbia is full of New Democrats. They just don't know it yet. And I believe Canada is the exact same way. All of you need to go back to where you come from and say to your neighbors, say to people you've never talked to before, have you thought about the NDP? And when they start down their recitation of liberal and conservative talking points, say, oh yeah, that's just politics. But what about your family? What about your kids? Is your mom and dad got a place to go when they can't stay in the house anymore? Who's thinking about that for you? New Democrats are thinking about that. Who's thinking about how we're going to get through these challenges of climate change, these challenges of disruption and dislocation in our social institutions? New Democrats are going to do that. I don't see Liberals doing that. I certainly don't see Conservatives doing that. And I don't know what the Greens are doing. Elizabeth May's coming back. I thought she was canceled 3 seasons ago. I don't get this. Don't ratings mean anything anymore? I don't know. But we in this room are on a wave, brothers and sisters, and it's not just in British Columbia. It's right across the country. And we need to hold fast to those values that bring us together, not just tonight to have a beautiful meal and to share war stories, but the things that we need to go out and talk to other people about. Talk to people you've never talked to before. Our echo chamber is kind of stale. We need new people. Yeah. Bring them in by telling the story of how we all got here, not as dry as we often do. Spice it up a bit. But the foundations of who we are, we all know that. It's part of us. It's our liturgy, as I can bring back the social gospel. We are here to make life better for those who can't do it themselves. What a great calling. What a great way to spend your days on this good earth. What a great way to do that. Pages, infrastructure, housing, labor, we did all of that. Sick days, we got that. Hang on, it's okay, there's some good stuff at the end. I always have one. Adrian always says, check against delivery every time I stand up. Before I can get the words out of my mouth, he already knows I'm going to say something different. I want to conclude by talking about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I want to talk a little bit about my criticisms earlier of our public education system. I have 2 degrees in history, and I didn't learn about residential schools until I was an elected representative in a gymnasium hearing from a survivor in 2006. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission opened all of our eyes to what had been before us for all of our lives, and we just didn't know about it because nobody told us. And now, with the discovery in Tk'emlúps and Secwepemc territory of 215 unmarked graves and other findings in Saskatchewan and British Columbia and other places, we can no longer turn our backs on this story. When you're watching Hockey Night in Canada and they're lamenting and putting 215 on scoreboards across Canada, finally, the grotesque injustice of the residential school process is laid bare for all of us to acknowledge and speak the truth, because without truth, there can be no reconciliation. We all have to internalize this. We didn't do it, but it happened in our country, and we can never let it happen again. So when we introduced the Declaration, I was a huge supporter of the treaty process. I worked with Mike Harcourt. He brought it in British Columbia. BC is unlike the rest of the country in terms of unceded territory. There were no significant treaties in BC, modest ones in southern Vancouver Island and a little bit in the Alberta/BC part of the Peace Country, but the rest of the great province is unceded territory. And for decades, BC governments would just not acknowledge that. Nope, not true. These people just arrived as well, and that's all there is to it. And it was Mike Harcourt that started the transformation of how British Columbia looked at the lay of the land. The Supreme Court had been assisting us, of course, in that regard by saying, you people are dreaming in Technicolor if you think that Indigenous people haven't been here since time immemorial and that they have title to these lands. It was confirmed case after case after case, and finally, the Silcotin decision in 2014 made it abundantly clear. They said, here's the map. It's from that tree over there to this divide in the river, over to that mountain. That's Chilcotin territory. It's indisputable. It's like going to the title office and finding out how big your lot is in the subdivision you live in. It's real, it's there, and it exists in every corner, every square meter of British Columbia. So when we came to government, the treaty process of Mike Harcourt was stale. 20 years, some nations had been at a table with no resolution, piling up legal bills, but not getting to a place. And part of the deal, of course, was you had to extinguish any of your legal rights in order to reach final agreement on treaties. Ridiculous to think of it now as I stand here, but that was cutting-edge thinking in the 1990s. So when we had an opportunity, after 12 miserable years in opposition for me, it was 16 for Jenny, it was sitting down with Indigenous leaders and saying, well, if you don't want the treaty process, what do you want? And Grand Chief Stuart Phillip dropped down a little tiny pocket UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People on the desk in front of where we were meeting, and they said, you need to do this. He said, you need to do this. So it was a little tiny pocket. I mean, it's more grandiose when you go on the UN webpage and all of that, but it was a little tiny thing. And I took it on the plane home and I started reading through it and said, we can do that. We can do that. Why wouldn't we do that? And I kept flipping page after page, article after article. And what was catching people's attention was free, prior, and informed consent. Okay, what could be wrong with that? How could we say, as newcomers, settlers, I'm the son of an Irish immigrant, I just arrived here, how can I say to people who I know have been here for thousands of years, you have to prove that in court, and I'm not going to talk to you until you do? That's absurd, and I wasn't prepared to do that. So we sat down as a caucus, and we cobbled together the Declaration Act, and we introduced it in the legislature, and we forced the other parties in the legislature to support it because they had no choice. The moral imperative was right there squarely in front of you. And to turn your back on justice, finally justice for Indigenous peoples, would have been the most grotesque thing an elected representative could do. And we kind of made that case privately, and the leaders of the Indigenous community, the First Nations Leadership Council made that case to the leaders of the opposition parties, and it was passed unanimously. So no longer is it debatable in British Columbia that rights and title exist. It's part of the law of the land. And you know what? We didn't do that with a sign screaming at a building. We did that by electing more people than the other guys had and changing the law. That's what we have to do right across the country. The worst day in government is better than the best day in opposition. I can remember throwing some really good high inside fastballs at leaders of BC Liberal governments and thinking, well, what a good boy am I, pat myself on the back. And then I would walk out of the legislature and I'd go home and I'd say, what do you think of question period today, dear? And she goes, what? Question period, did you see question period today? I said, no, I had things to do. Everyone has things to do. And I don't want to diminish question period because I was this close to coming today. And then I thought, why would I do that? Why would I do that? It's important. Dave Barrett brought it in British Columbia. It's important. But I'm saying to you that the sun does not revolve around the head of elected representatives. Most people, I say this always, you wouldn't worry what people thought of you if you knew how seldomly they did. Most people are living their lives. Most people look to government and say, why are you not fixing that? When I was doing media interviews today and said, well, this Canada Health Transfer thing, isn't that just greedy politicians? I go, are you nuts? How do you think we pay for services in Canada? We tax people. There's no federal money tree. The money comes from across the country, from taxes. And provinces are saying, we need some of that back to provide the services that Canadians deserve. And more importantly, we need some of that back so we can have a human resource strategy in a time of labor scarcity where we can encourage people to get into healthcare because they're going to be compensated for that work. And more importantly, there are recruits on the way to help them with the workload. That's the solution to our challenges in healthcare. Not just more money. That's an easy argument for those who don't want to give you any money to say, well, you're just greedy. We need to be able to provide services for people. How do you do that? Paying other people to provide those services. The labor movement in this room understands that full well. And through cycles, you bargain hard to get improvements for your members. But more than anything, your members want more people. They want help with the load, particularly in healthcare. So my appeal to all of you as I leave the stage, and thank you for your time tonight and for not telling the water story, is that you need to win elections. You need to work harder than you've ever worked before in your community. The next time there's a running of the reptiles, you have to pick the right team and you have to be there for them, not just on election day. And this is particularly for women candidates. It's not good enough to just say, well, I voted for the woman candidate. You have to support the woman candidate. The mayor of Peterborough, I have an affinity to Peterborough. She was abused out of office. And she basically said, my message to all of you is fuck off. And I said, good for you, good for you. Because that's exactly what she should say. And it's not good enough to just put an X in the box to support women candidates. You have to support them while they make the tough choices of governing as well. Because there's nothing more sickening than watching women be abused by mostly men who think they have a better idea and the anonymity of their keyboard. Support each other. Be kind to each other. Vote NDP. Thank you.